I have been practicing meditation, Raja Yoga meditation with the Brahma Kumaris now for about 45 years. And in my own life journey, I think that what really attracted me to this practice was that it was my own direct connection with God. But along the journey of life, even though I loved my own connection with God, we meet people who inspire us spiritually. And it was probably about 45 years ago, as I said, I was living in London and I met Dadi Janki. And I think she has been an extraordinary influence on my life for a very, very long time. And only recently she passed away, and so many memories have been flooding in my mind about her. And perhaps how she has helped me on my journey of change, of learning about myself and transformation. So many things that I've learned from her, because she was a very wise teacher, loved to share, but was not only someone who shared, but she lived it in practical. She'd want to do it herself first. But probably the greatest thing that has influenced me, or she taught me, was how to love God. You know, really her whole life was this incredible inspiration of such a deep love for God that it pulled her beyond so many influences and so many obstacles, I would say, in her life. And I can remember being in a meeting with her once at the headquarters of the Brahma Kumaris in Mount Abu. And there was a group of us from all different countries of the world. And we were discussing different things. Suddenly she stopped. And she looked at us, and we often call it, drishti, the vision through her eyes. Just so much love. It was like her eyeballs were just little balls of love, radiating love and respect. And this went on for many, many minutes in silence. And then finally she began to speak. And I remember so clearly she said, "It's love that makes me move. It's love that makes me tireless. It's love that has taken me beyond all the obstacles in my life. And it's love that's made me step out of all those limitations." You know how in life we limit ourselves. Oh, I'm not educated, I'm not this, I'm not that. But her life is a story, an incredible story of a young woman, only 3 years of education. And yet she just crossed boundary after boundary. And by the end of her life, she was loved and respected all over this world, and by incredibly influential people, many world figures. Only recently, one of cricket's greatest names in the world said to me that probably the greatest inspiration, one of the greatest inspirations in his life, was Dadi Janki. And so she had an extraordinary influence on so many. And maybe just a little bit of my story, how I came in touch with her. I'm actually from Melbourne. I grew up in Melbourne, and my family wasn't very religious at all, and yet we would go to church occasionally. And once they sent me along for confirmation classes, which is sort of like a formal entry into the church. I was 12 years old, and I went along for a while, and then my family said, "Well, what have you learned? What have you learned from these confirmation classes?" My mum and dad. And I said, "I think I'm an atheist." And I found it, to be frank, I respect all the religions, but I couldn't relate to what was being taught, because God was a very punishing, judgmental, authoritarian figure, and I couldn't connect. But still I was on this search, and I finished school. I went to university to study architecture at Melbourne University, but my heart wasn't in it. So I took time out and I traveled the world. And I traveled through Southeast Asia, I traveled through India, the Middle East, Africa, Europe. I was 20 years old. It was probably the best education I've ever had, because I lived in religious communities everywhere. I lived with Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Sikhs and Taoists and yogis. And as I was traveling, my real question was, well, everyone talks about interesting stuff, but how do you experience it? How do you translate that theory, this doctrine, this belief? How do you feel it, really feel it inside? And when I settled in London, I was still on my search, and I went to a place in London called the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain in Hyde Park Corner. And this is where I met Dadi Janki. And she used to come there with Sister Janki, who's the director of the European Centres of the Brahma Kumaris. And they every week would conduct a class, and Sister Janki would speak because she spoke English. Dadi Janki didn't have English. But Dadi Janki would sit there in meditation, and quite honestly, I was fascinated by her face, this incredibly expressive face, and her feeling. And I could see in her face, she was experiencing something from God. It wasn't just a following a path or a belief or a religion in that way. She was really feeling something inside, and I wanted some of it too. And so I went along to the headquarters of the Brahma Kumaris outside of India at that time, which was in northwest London. And quite honestly, it's this tiny little house. Dadi Janki was living there. And the teacher was Sister Sudesh, who is now based in Germany. And she would give me a few lessons in the Brahma Kumaris Raj Yoga meditation. And then Dadi Janki would come in and lead the meditation. And in the Brahma Kumaris, we meditate with our eyes open. And often when we have a senior yogi, they look in the soul to help the soul move beyond the body and connect with God. So they look in the eyes and the soul. And Daddy gave me drishti, and I had such amazing experiences of feeling myself going beyond. It was really quite special. And it made a lot of sense to me immediately. And so I spent the next 15 months living in London. And actually, I got a house just over the road from the centre. I moved with a friend, and I was going to the centre absolutely every day. And I was absolutely amazed by Dadi Janki's generosity of spirit. I think her passion, and I think that's the right word, for God was equal to her passion to help others, to support others, to benefit others, really without wanting anything in return. And you could imagine we were a young group of Westerners, so to speak, coming along, but she gave so much, her incredible generosity. She would miss her meals, miss her sleep, miss anything to uplift others, support others, and benefit others. And I would come every day, and I spent a lot of time with her in those days. And I think they were such formative times for me. And I have a memory one night that I was in my little place opposite the meditation center where Dadi Janki was living. And late at night, there was a knock, knock, knock on the door. And I opened the door, and there was Dadi Janki with a Jesuit priest from Germany or Holland. And she had this huge smile on her face. And this man had come to talk to Daddy about connecting with God. You know, a Jesuit priest, Jesuits have this love for God, but he really wanted to know, how do you really connect soul to soul with God? And they'd had this conversation for hours. And then she offered him to stay. So she came across to my place, and I could just see the happiness on her face. And what I found, she never judged. It didn't matter what background people were from. She just loved people who loved God. Anyone who loved God, she really felt close to, and all she wanted to do, if she was able to even help them come closer to God. And I can remember we went all over England. There was a little tiny Morris Minor. Now these are little tiny, it was a little tiny green car. And often we would go to different parts of the UK where she was invited to give talks. And she would sit in the front seat. Sister Janki would drive the car, and the whole way Daddy would talk in Hindi, and Sister Janki was driving and translating for us in the back. And she had such a depth of understanding, and she would always be thinking very deeply on any subject. I even noticed that when she met somebody and she saw that that person was loved by others, or that person had something special, she would always think, what is that in that person that's making others love them or cooperate with them or want to be with them? She would always think so deeply and share that thinking. And I really loved, listening to that wisdom. And I think it really gave me an incredible foundation for my own spiritual journey. But I remember once we went to Oxford, which is really one of my favorite cities in the world, really one of the world's great universities. And she was invited to speak. And this must have been 1976, I would say. And when we arrived at Oxford University for this talk, as we walked in the door, imagine I had been practicing for about 6 months, Daddy turned to me and said, "Charlie, you start the lecture." I was like 22 years old. And in those days, not much confidence, and I thought, oh. But anyway, I did. I spoke for a few minutes before her. But she was really, she'd put you on the spot sometimes. And she would stretch you, so you stretched your boundaries. You just didn't live in your comfort zone. She loved to push you. And what I really found with her was she would learn your value. She had this uncanny ability. Once I asked her, "Daddy, what's your particular specialty?" And she said to really know the intent of others. She said, "I can love everyone because I know their intent." Because the intent in others is really good. And she would always see the good in you. And I felt her vision on me was always so positive. In fact, to be honest, I at first felt my vision was here, but her vision was up here. But actually, she really saw the goodness and saw your potential, and was always encouraging you to grow into the person you could really be. And she often used to say to me, "I have rights over you," meaning she could tell me what she really thought. And sometimes she would correct me. And with some people, maybe I was a little bit sensitive, but with Daddy, I really appreciated it, because behind that correction was so much love. It came not as a criticism, but her love for me to change, for me to improve, for me to really, become a better person. And I have many memories of this. And we also had a singing group in London, which I was a part of. And they had a really wonderful group of musicians. One of them was in one of the top rock bands in the world at the time. Another was a West Indian brother with a superb voice. And Daddy used to get us to go around to different places and sing. And I even learned to sing a few songs in Hindi as well through that. But one time I remember we were in London, and we went to visit a man who was responsible for some of the religious television on the BBC. And we went to see him in his church in the heart of London. And it was an old church, a beautiful old church, and he had an office at the back of the church. And I can remember I went with Daddy, and when we walked into his office, it was a huge office with books everywhere. He was a great scholar of philosophy and religion around the world. And Daddy and him began to meet and to talk to each other. And I was just observing the conversation that, this man was a lovely man, but, he was like an intellectual. And I was looking at their faces, and his face, didn't show that sparkle and peace of Daddy. And it really actually taught me that, religion and philosophy is to practice. Often today we believe it, but it's not really absorbed into my life and my actions. And that's what I absolutely saw in Dadi Janki. She was constantly observing herself, observing her weaknesses, changing her weaknesses, and trying to practice and bring her truth, her relationship with God, into her life, which was revealed on her face, in her vibrations, in her actions, and much more. And I can remember once she encouraged me to go to the headquarters of the Brahma Kumaris in India. I'd only been coming for a few months. And she really said to me, now go to Mount Abu, and this is like another step in your journey. And she had so much encouragement for me to go deeper. And then another time, after I was back in London for some time, I hadn't been to Australia. I hadn't seen my family since I'd started to meditate. And when I took leave from her, when I went to go to Australia, she wasn't well. Dadi Janki's life was a life with, she had many illnesses during her time, but she would never complain about them. She always even used them to grow and learn about herself. She often used to say that she'd talk to her body, now you have to cooperate with me. She actually had this relationship with her body. But I went to see her in her room and she wasn't well. She was lying in her bed and she got up on her elbow and looked at me and gave me that drishti like I was talking about. And really there was light in her eyes. Her eyes were shining. And I could see that even though that body wasn't well, the soul was sparkling. The soul was still with God. And she said to me, I was very young, I was very new. She said to me, okay, Charlie, you go to Australia, but as soon as you have any problems or difficulties, get on the next plane and come straight back here. That was her advice to me. Well, I went to Australia and we began a center in Melbourne, a meditation center. I was, 23 years old at the time. And I was so new. And I remember those were the days of writing letters, and I wrote a letter to Daddy. And in that letter, I said, there's a woman coming with a young child. And she has this problem and that problem. And it was a long, long pages of letter, explaining what should I do, my question. And I have a very dear friend who was in London at the time, Waddy. She's Irish. She now runs our center in Miami. And Waddy told me that Daddy opened my letter and she read my letter. She learned to read English. And she laughed till the tears came out of her eyes. Said, oh, Charlie's just like a new mother worrying about his first baby. She had a great sense of humor too. And she was very loving, very supportive, and sometimes lots of fun as well. And she kept this balance of sometimes really, she was quite strict. She could be very strict and yet extremely loving. I felt everyone who lived around her you could just feel this deep love she had for absolutely everybody. And she came to Australia maybe 6 or 7 times. And the last time was when we had the Parliament of the World's Religions. And it's a huge thing that happens every 3 or 4 years, and 5,000 delegates from every imaginable religion. And Dadi Janki was actually invited to speak at one of the plenary sessions because she was then the head of the Brahma Kumaris worldwide. And she, I think, attended maybe 15 or 20 sessions because she went to so many different groups. They invited her. She was so much loved because she's as comfortable with any religion. Her spirituality means she has no sort of judgment of difference in any way. And I can remember she went into a Sikh group and she spoke to them in Gurumukhi, and she went to a Buddhist group and a Christian group. And, her heart's really big and she has love for absolutely everybody. But I would say that I have experienced, so much learning, not just through the words of Dadi Janki, but I would say through her actions and even her attitude. I would say she taught through her attitude. One of my friends in London, I remember him telling me once when he arrived at the door of the Brahma Kumaris, he said, I was in a low state. I felt very negative about everything, especially me. And he said that he would come along to the center sometimes in quite a negative, depressed mood. When you see life is dark, there's not much meaning in life. And he said that Dadi Janki was often there, and she'd always encourage him. And he said his vision on himself was so negative, but Daddy refused to accept that. She learned his value, and her vision always remained on his value. That's what she saw. And he said if he came to the center, his mood was up, his mood was down, he was like this, he was like that. She could see his potential, and that's where her vision always fell. And he often says that it was her faith and trust in him that really enabled him to come out of his depression. And if you saw him now, he's just one of the most loving, kind, and inspiring human beings. But he said it was Daddy's attitude, her vision on him, that really helped him move forward. And I remember one of the last experiences I had with her was with a group we call in the Brahma Kumaris the regional coordinators. And these are people from our offices in London, New York, Moscow, Nairobi, Africa, and Sydney, and also South America, Sao Paulo. And we've been meeting for about 36 years. Twice a year we meet in India, and we're very close. We've got to know each other really well. And Dadi Janki, because she was coordinating all the centers around the world, would meet with us. And you know, she would always be so encouraging. She would always encourage a unity amongst us and the power of the gathering when we're unified. But this time, as she grew older and older, she wouldn't speak much. And this last time, she came into the gathering and didn't say a word, and she looked at each one of us around the room with so much love, and then called each one of us and just hugged us and held us, and through those eyes, those little beacons of love, just shared so much deep love and appreciation. And I thought there couldn't be a more powerful thing a leader can do than just to invest such faith, such trust, and such appreciation. You could feel it. It was absolutely tangible. And that room was just filled with such an atmosphere. And that was her power. She would walk into a room with that sparkling face, those sparkling eyes, and just fill the room with joy and fill the room, the hearts with, you know, so much love. And over the years, I saw her meet, you know, so many influential people around the world. And, you know, they treasured her company and her wisdom. And I remember one of them who is in the House of Lords in the UK, who is the chief executive officer of one of England's biggest companies. And he would just love Daddy's wisdom. And, you know, he had so many degrees, so many experience, but Dadi Janki's wisdom was learned in life. She actually learned it from life experience. It wasn't textbook learning, wasn't university learning. And she had such an insight in my experience into human nature and how to respond to people and how to really bring out the best in everyone around her. And so over many, many, many years, I would meet Dadi. I always felt this extraordinary goodwill from her. And I would say in my own spiritual journey, she's probably been the greatest influence on me. And her courage to face anything, no matter what came in front of her, calmly and with such a stable mind, has been such an inspiration to me. And so when I find challenges, the inevitable challenges in life come my way, I really remember her and remember how calm and stable, and she would always respond based on truth, a deep understanding of the law of karma, and love for God, so that the actions are always filled with that truth and that love for God. So in this time where many of us are not worshipping Dadi Janki, bowing down to Dadi Janki, but just deeply, deeply appreciating an absolutely extraordinary life that she lived, an inspirational life. So I'm just sharing a few of my experiences. There's many, many more, but I think that's probably enough for today. Thank you so much.